Hello, this is Leroy Meadows, and welcome to this session. And in this session, we're continuing our example from the previous example. So this will be example 2 of process costing. In the first example, we took the same information and computed everything out using the weighted average method. In this session, we're going to take that same information but account for everything under the first in, first out method. So let's go ahead and review the information. The assembly division of Quality Timepieces Incorporated uses the weighted average method of process costing. And as we just talked about here, we're actually going to use first in, first out. So consider the following data for the month of May 2017. Beginning work in process inventory, 100 units. And that 100 units had direct material costs associated with it of $459,888. And then finally, conversion costs of $142,570. We started 510 units in May. In May, we also completed 450 units, and we had 160,000 units in ending inventory. And the total costs added during May 2017, $3,237,000. And then for conversion costs, $1,916,000. One thing we have to note here, when we're using first in, first out, we have to note the degree of completion of both beginning work in process inventory and ending work in process inventory. Why do we need that? Because in, first out, the degree of completion that was previously done is not carrying over. Remember, in, first out, if you watched the videos before, you understand that we only focus on work done in this period only. So in this period, I am going to complete the units in work in process. I am going to then add work and do more work to the units started this period, some of which will be completed, some of which will be in ending work in process inventory. So let's go ahead and get started here. My beginning work in process inventory was 100 units. And how many units did I start in May? 510. So how many units do I have to account for here? I have to account for 610. Now we're going to compute our completed and transferred out during the current period. Now that's going to involve two different things. That's first going to involve the beginning units of inventory. And why is that? Because we're assuming that the first units started are the first units going out. So we're assuming that the flow of process, first units in, first units out. So if I completed 450 units, of that 100 units was from beginning inventory, how many of those units were started and completed this period? That would be 350. So therefore, I have my 450 units completed and transferred out, but 100 of that was from beginning inventory, and the remainder of those units were units that I started in the period and I also completed. And then I also have my ending work in process inventory of 160 units. So now, let's take a look at the computations for equivalent units, step 2 of the 5-step process. We have to figure out from our beginning inventory how much work did we do on those beginning units. So how we did, and how was the degree of completion at the beginning of the period that, or work that was already done previously? For direct materials, 80% was completed already before this month. So how much left do I have to do in order to get those 100% complete? Well, if I need to get those 100% complete and 80% of that work was already done, I need to do 20 more percent of adding direct materials. So I'm going to take from my beginning work in process inventory, I'm going to take my 100 units and multiply that by the amount of direct materials I still have to add this period, not what was added before. So I only have to add the remaining 20%, and that gives me 20 equivalent units for direct materials from beginning inventory. Now let's take a look at the conversion costs. My conversion costs, they were 35% complete at the end of last period. So how much did I have to do to make those 100% complete this period? Well, if we need to make those 100% complete, 35% of that conversion was last period, then we have to do the remaining 65% this period. So I'm going to take my 100 units and multiply that by 0.65 to get me 65 equivalent units from beginning inventory. Now, the started and completed units, the fact that we started them and completed in this period means we did everything in this period for them. So they are fully complete with respect to materials and conversion costs. Now, let's take a look at the value of, or the ending work in process inventory. I have 160 units in ending work in process inventory. Now, of that, before the end of the month came, I added 80% of the materials. So I'm going to go ahead and take my 160, multiply that by the 80% of materials I put in this period, and that gives me equivalent units of 128. Then I'm going to take my 160 units and multiply that by the amount of completion of conversion costs I added this period. And this period, conversion costs of my ending work in process inventory is 40%. So I added 40% of the conversion costs. So I'm going to take my 160 and multiply that by 0.40. And that gives me 64 equivalent units for conversion costs for ending work in process inventory. So now I want to figure out, I had to account for 610 units. How many units did I account for here? Well, if I add those up, I accounted for 610. So I accounted for all those units. So now let's compute the equivalent units of work done to date. And we're simply going to take the total of the amount of work I had to do this period on my beginning inventory, add to that the amount of work I did on those units I started and completed, and then the amount of work I've already incurred this period for my ending work in process inventory. And when we do that, we will get total equivalent units of work done to date of 498 units. And actually, that should be equivalent units of work done in the current period. So let's rework that there. There we go. So what's my equivalent units of work done in the current period for conversion costs? I'm going to add in my 65 plus my 350 plus my 64 here. And that's going to be the equivalent units of work done in the current period here. And that is exercise 26. Now, exercise 27 is going to be a continuation of this. And we're going to do the remainder of the process or the production report here for this month. So let's take a look here. Now we're required to, and let's pull this up here so we can do this. And let's move this down just a little bit. And let me get this here. And let's get that. Okay, so now let's determine our production cost per equivalent unit of the work done in this period, and then total cost to account for and assigning costs. So what was my beginning cost of work in process inventory? It was 459,888. We computed that up here. So 459,888. What was my conversion cost in beginning inventory? We see that right here. 142,750. So how much of total production cost did I have in beginning inventory? Well, it's simply the sum of my direct materials and conversion costs, which are, so my total beginning work in process inventory under first in, first out, 602,638. Now, we have the computer cost added in during the period. How much do we have in direct materials added in during the period? We are told here in the problem, right here in this table here, $3,237,000. And how much the conversion costs were added? We're told right here, $1,916,000. So how much in total direct material cost do I have to account for? I have to account for $3,696,888. And how much in total conversion cost do I have to account for? I have to account for $2,058,750. So what was my total cost added in during the period? $5,153,000, and my total cost to account for between direct materials and conversion costs, $5,755,638. So let's go ahead here and clean this up a bit. Now, for step 4, under first in, first out, I only want the costs in this period and this period alone. Under weighted average, I would have taken my total cost to account for, but we're not doing the weighted average in this section. We're doing the first in, first out method. So I'm going to take my costs added in during the current period, because that's all I care about. And then I'm going to divide that by the equivalent units of production done in the current period, which we figured out in step 2. So for direct materials, let's take a look here. Costs in the current period, $3,237,000. Divided by the equivalent units of work done in the current period, 498. We determined that up here. And when I do that, and when I divide that out, I get a cost per equivalent unit of $6,500. Let's go ahead and do it with this. I'll take my costs added in during the current period for conversion costs, divide that by the equivalent units of work done in the current period for conversion costs, 479, as we saw up here, and my total conversion or cost per equivalent unit of work done in the current period for conversion costs, $4,000. Now, here's where we really got to pay attention here. I've got my cost per equivalent unit, and we've got to pay attention up here too, because if we miss this up here, everything else is going to be moot when it comes to cost per equivalent unit and then assignment of costs. Now, when we're assigning costs, we first have got to, if we're transferring out the beginning inventory first, then it makes sense we've got to transfer those costs out as well. So for completed and transferred out, I have two things? For completed and transferred out, I got costs associated with the beginning work in process inventory that carried over from last period, as well as the costs in the current period. And we're going to figure out the cost in the current period here in just a second. But the cost of work in process beginning inventory, we're already given that information. Remember, that was $459,888. So actually, I'm just going to copy that over. And my beginning inventory had conversion costs of $142,750. Now, what I'm going to do is for my costs added, and that was work in process, costs added to beginning work in process. So those were costs I had already incurred in the previous period. Now I've got to account for the costs I incurred this period to finish off that beginning work in process so I can make it complete and transfer it out. So I'm going to take my cost per equivalent unit of work done in the period for direct materials, the 6,500, and multiply that By the 20 equivalent units, I added this period to my direct materials, and that will give me a cost of $130,000. So what are the totals from beginning inventory? So the total beginning inventory costs are going to be $589,888. Now let's look at conversion costs. Did I do any conversion work this period on beginning inventory? Yes, I did. I did 6,500 equivalent units of work done from to beginning inventory to make those complete. So I'm going to take my cost per equivalent unit of $4,000 for conversion costs and multiply that by the equivalent units of work I did to beginning inventory to make them to finish them off and make them complete. And I did $260,000 worth of work. So now we're going to account for our beginning work in process inventory of 602,458 work that was done last period. And to that, I'm going to add the work done to beginning inventory this period. And how much was the work I did this period? The total value of the work I did this period was $390,000. So how much in total inventory did I do for, let's see. So total cost of beginning inventory is $992,458. And that's the sum total of my conversion cost. These costs here, work in process beginning, that was cost carried over from last month, plus the costs right here in row 28 of costs that I added this period. So the total cost of beginning inventory that was now transferred out is $992,638. Of that, $589,888 is related to direct materials, and the remainder is related to conversion costs. Now, what about the units started and completed? Well, the units started and completed, I did what? I did 350 units I started and completed. So now for direct materials, for the cost of units started and completed, how much it cost did I incur that I'm going to assign to those units? Well, I'm going to take my $6,500 cost per equivalent unit, multiply that by the 350 equivalent units completed and transferred out, and I'm going to have $2,275,000. Now, let's take a look here, and let's do our conversion costs. Our conversion costs, how much in conversion costs did I incur this month for the units completed and started and completed? Well, $4,000 cost per equivalent unit. I can multiply that by the 350 equivalent units of work done this period for conversion costs, and I have a total of $1,400,000. So how much total cost did I have put into the units I started and completed? Well, I'm going to simply add that up. And the total value of the units I started and completed this period were $3,675,000. So what was the total cost of units completed and transferred out? Total cost of beginning inventory plus the cost of units started and completed this period. For direct materials, I take my total from beginning inventory, the amount I incurred before and the amount I added this period, which is $589,888. And I'm going to add to that the costs associated with direct materials for the units started and completed. And when I do that, I get direct material costs total of $2,864,888. Now, what was the total cost of units completed and transferred out with respect to conversion costs in that category? I'm going to take my $402,750 worth of total conversion costs from beginning inventory, and that's a combination of what the conversion costs we incurred before plus the conversion costs we incurred this period, and that gives me a total of $1,802,750. So what is the total value of my work of the units completed and transferred out, combining beginning inventory and then the units we started and completed this period? And that is going to be $4,667,638. And I'm showing a different number here. And I missed something here. And give me just a moment here. Okay, and I do see where I made a mistake here. I transposed these numbers, which is why it's always good if you're going to use Excel to go ahead and relate all these different cells together by using cell functions and stuff like that. So I put 142,750 here instead of 142,570. So 142,570, and that's the number I'm looking for. 4,667,458. So now everything is back to normal and the way it should be. So now that's the total cost of units completed and transferred out. So when I make my journal entry, I'm going to debit the work in process account for the next department for $4,667,458, this amount right here. And I'm going to credit our department here for that same amount, because now I'm removing it from an asset from this department and we're just transferring it really from one asset account to another. It's really all we're doing, because we're moving to the next department here. So now I want to put a value on my ending inventory. Under first in, first out, I will take my cost per equivalent unit and multiply that by the equivalent units in ending work in process inventory, and I have $832,000 worth of direct materials. If I do the same thing for my conversion costs, I'm going to have $256,000. So what is the total value of my ending work in process inventory? The total value is going to be, when I add these two up, $1,088,000. Of that, $832,000 is associated with direct materials, and the remaining $256,000 is associated with conversion costs up here. So now we want to find out, did I account for all the costs? I had the cost to account for up here. How much cost am I accounting for? So I'm simply going to add up together the value of the units transferred out plus the units in ending inventory. And when I do that and I go across the board like that, I will see that these numbers match from conversion costs, direct materials, and then my work in process. And actually, I made that error up here. So let's see. So let's go back and do my cell reference. And 142,570. Now everything's right. And now everything matches. So again, another reason, whenever you're doing things in Excel and you're doing things, you want to use as many cell formulas as possible, because you want to go back to the earliest instance where you made a mistake, change it, and changes everything down the line here. So there's a good lesson I hadn't planned on giving, but needless to say, I'm happy that you were able to see how easy that was to change one number. And instead of having to be on pencil and paper and doing a lot of erasing, I can actually change everything here. And once I make a change somewhere in one place, everything that flows down after that will be changed as well. So this was exercise 26 and 27 for process costing. So again, this is Leroy Meadows. I want to thank you for joining me. Have a good day.